We're back. Good afternoon. I'm Dorothea Williams with A to Z Educational Consultants. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Tom Anderson, who has served in many leadership positions from principal to assistant superintendent in the state of California. One of his many areas of expertise is special education. Today our conversation will focus on special education. So, Dr. Anderson, what do you think special education educators need to be aware of during this pandemic?
Well, clearly, special education is a whole new ballgame when we talk about distance learning. We're working with students that we are not face-to-face with, that we don't see eye to eye with on a day-to-day basis. And we're trying to do the best that we can, and everybody really is, but we clearly are operating under a different paradigm. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that the needs of our students are going to be different. Whether it is a 100% distance learning model, a hybrid model of sorts, or something else, this clearly is not standard schooling. This is not what we're typically used to. And as educators, we really need to come at it with the idea that the goal of an IEP is to ensure that students with special needs have equal access to the instructional program. So the instructional program right now is different. It's distance learning. So an IEP should be founded, or a short-term, a temporary IEP, things we're working on right now, should be founded on the idea that the educational model is different. So the supports and structures that need to be put in place for students with special needs may need to be different for a while at least.
That makes sense. So if you are a special education teacher and you have students that normally would also receive support from your assist in your classroom, is there a way that that person can still work with that student even though they are not in a direct school environment?
Certainly. What I've seen work effectively under the current model is a teacher, whether that's a general education teacher or an education specialist, providing instruction. And then whether you're on a Google Classroom platform or Schoology or one of these various technological platforms we're using these days, there are ways to do breakout rooms and small group support sessions. And that's really where our instructional assistants and our aides come into play. Again, it's not ideal. It's not face-to-face, although it is now, the way that we operate now. But there is the opportunity for instructional assistants to really target their support for students. And that's designed by the educational specialist and the general ed teacher as they put together a program to ensure that students with special needs receive the supports necessary to access instruction.
Okay, that makes sense. So it sounds like all of the IEPs have to be amended in a district so that they can get this new education plan. Is that what you're saying?
So that's one school of thought, is that we're doing things differently. We need to rewrite these IEPs, but guidance from the state here in California and many other states has been that this is a temporary situation. And we typically do not rewrite an IEP for a temporary situation. We may amend the IEP, we may write an addendum. There are various ways to document a change. For instance, if a student went on independent study, we note that in the IEP, but we don't rewrite the entire IEP because they're going to be coming back to us. And all of our students are going to be coming back to us. As soon as we can get through this pandemic, as soon as we can get back to school as usual, and it may not be as usual. I think we all know there's going to be a new normal, but that new normal will certainly include in-person instruction. And so if we rewrote every IEP, we'd rewrite every IEP again in 2 months or 6 months or however long it takes for us to come back to school. So typically what we're doing in school districts is we're writing individual distance learning plans, which are part of the current IEP, kind of an addendum. You could call them an addendum, or in addition to the IEP. And it really is simply documenting what the student's program looks like right now based on distance learning, which is different than obviously what it would look like if they're at school 6 or 7 hours a day and there's a lot of in-person things going on. So most students with special needs are receiving some sort of a document, whether it's something called an emergency conditions form or an individual distance learning plan or something to show how we're addressing their needs through distance learning, what those accommodations and modifications and supports look like in this new paradigm.
Okay, that's very informative. So if you were talking to a parent, what would a parent need to know during this time?
So the first thing, the most important thing is that parents need to continue to be their child's number one advocate. That's their job. So they really need to communicate with their school staff, whether that's the case manager, general ed teacher, even principal on occasion, about what their student is succeeding at, what they're struggling with, which accommodations are effective, which are not. And if there's a greater need, they need to relay that information to the school staff. Now, keep in mind that the entire intent of an IEP is to adjust or supplement or accommodate students within a learning model, an instructional model. And that model is different now. Everyone is experiencing distance learning. So when we talk about asking for accommodations for our students with special needs, it needs to be within the framework of what distance learning is. So we don't have people going into people's homes. We're not sending staff typically in to work one-on-one with a student. Now they can do that via Zoom. We may be getting back shortly here to some students coming on campus for small periods of time for in-person instruction, but we're not there yet. So currently, parents need to continue advocating, but they need to understand it's not going to be the same level of support that they would typically get when their child was at school all day.
Okay, because I've heard from some parents that they have in their students' IEP has a specific amount of minutes that they're supposed to receive, like speech, or they're supposed to have so many minutes of counseling. And they're saying their students aren't getting those minutes. And so that's in violation of the IEP. But I don't think that that's what you're saying.
So really good question and really complex issue. So when we went off last year, when we closed down schools and kids stayed home and education kind of stopped on a dime, a lot of services did not come to students immediately. Most school districts tackled those challenges and found ways to get students at least some level of support and services, whether that's speech or occupational therapy or education related mental health services. But some districts struggled more than others to do that, to get that to students. As we came back to school this year, there was a higher expectation for us to be able to provide services and supports to students, even though we were continuing to start with a distance learning model, just like there was a higher expectation for general education. Students needed to be in class more. We needed to track that better. We needed to find those students that weren't engaged and find ways to engage them. And the same is true for students with special needs. Those that just did not get anything or did not sign on or were not present or anywhere to be found the last few months of last school year, we needed to re-engage and find ways to support them. And for the most part, that's been done. It's not the same level of support they would get if they were in class 6 or 7 hours a day. But again, the idea of an IEP is to make sure they can access their education. And right now, education is distance learning. So we need to find ways for students to access distance learning. And as parents, you need to be in close contact, especially with your case managers or service providers, about whether your student is engaged, whether they are accessing those services. And if they're not, brainstorm ways to get them those services and get them access points so they can get those supports.
Okay. Another question that I've heard from parents who have students who have special needs is that they are finding that they're, especially kids in the middle grades or upper elementary, and even some of the high school students, they're noticing depression. And they did not have in their IEPs in the past that they had counseling services or something of that nature. So is it too late? They can't get services in those areas? What should a parent do?
So again, a parent needs to be their child's first advocate, and they need to stand up for what they think their child needs. What you're describing is things that we're all hearing, and it is very typical out there, but it's not strictly related to students with special needs.
Oh,
We're
okay.
hearing that many of our students have experienced trauma in the last 6 or 8 months, whether that's just trauma from not being able to attend school, whether it's trauma in the home, whether they've had pandemic related issues or trauma. But we are hearing that social emotional supports are going to be um, at an all-time high in terms of need for students, and not just students, staff, teachers, parents. We're all going through this. And as we come back to school, there's going to be a higher need for that kind of counseling and social emotional supports. And students with special needs are a part of that, but it's not isolated to them. So if they didn't have educationally related mental health services in their IEP before, there's not necessarily a reason to put it in there now. They should have the same equitable access to those types of services that every other student should have. Um, Now, that said, we do have students that did have it in their IEP, and their issues may have been exacerbated by what we've been going through. So again, that's time for a parent, an IEP team to get together and discuss the new need, whether it's at a higher level or just with a different kind of service delivery, to ensure that students do get those services, because many of our students are qualified for special education based on their needs around anxiety and depression and things like that, and social issues. So there may be higher needs out there, and that's the time for an IEP team to get together and decide, is there a short-term need? Is it a long-term need? And what access do we have for those students to ensure that they're getting what they need?
Dr. Anderson, I want to thank you for your time. This has been very valuable information, and it needs to be shared with many. I think it's helpful for teachers and for parents alike. And again, I just cannot thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.